Hi and welcome. You are listening to Listen and Relax. Sit back and enjoy these online dating stories. If you want us to continue making these videos, please let us know in the comments what you think about the stories and if we should continue. Please like, comment, subscribe, and hit that notification bell to stay updated when we post new exciting stories. These horror stories are all based on true stories. Thank you for listening. The Howling Wolf, the mysterious figure on the mountain. It was a warm summer night in West Virginia, and my brother and I decided to sleep on the porch of our family cabin. We had always loved the peace and quiet of the place, far away from the hustle and bustle of the city. The cabin sat at the edge of a small forest, and beyond that, the towering mountains stretched into the distance. The stars above twinkled brightly, and the air was crisp with the faint scent of pine trees. It felt like the perfect night for stargazing, and we were looking forward to falling asleep under the open sky. We spread out our blankets, laid back, and began chatting, occasionally glancing up at the starry sky. It was the kind of night where everything feels calm, where the world seems to pause and hold its breath. The only sounds were the gentle rustling of leaves in the trees and the distant calls of animals in the woods. But then, something broke the silence. At first, it was just a faint sound, almost like a distant, eerie howl carried on the wind. It didn't seem to belong to any animal we knew. It wasn't a typical wolf's cry, nor was it like anything we'd ever heard in the forests of West Virginia. It was a deep, mournful sound, one that sent a chill down my spine. I looked at my brother, and I could tell he had heard it too. His face was pale, his eyes wide with confusion and worry. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my voice barely a breath. He nodded silently, and we both stared out into the darkness. The sound came again, closer this time, the howls echoing off the mountains. It was unmistakable, a wolf's howl, but not quite. It sounded different, almost wrong. We strained our eyes, trying to see where the sound was coming from. And then we saw it. A dark figure stood on the crest of the mountain, far off in the distance. The figure was tall, its outline shadowy against the night sky. We couldn't make out any details, but it was standing there motionless as though watching us. My heart began to race. What was it? Who was it? Then, as if in response to the howl, the figure started to move. It was slow at first, but it became more deliberate, making its way down the side of the mountain, out of sight. My brother and I exchanged nervous glances. We couldn't be sure, but something about the whole situation didn't feel right. And that's when we heard it again. Footsteps, soft at first, but steadily getting louder. They were coming from around the cabin, circling us, moving with a quiet, deliberate pace. The footsteps weren't the sound of animals. They were too heavy, too slow. They were footsteps of someone, something walking deliberately around the house. My brother grabbed my arm. "We need to go inside. Now." Without hesitation, we jumped to our feet and rushed to the door, slamming it shut behind us. We locked it quickly and stood there in the darkness, listening intently. The footsteps continued, around the cabin, slowly. We could hear them clearly now, as if someone was walking just outside, as if they were trying to stay hidden, to stay just out of sight. We could hear every step, each one more deliberate than the last, moving closer. But when we dared to peek out the window, we saw nothing. The night outside was still and silent once more. The eerie howl from the mountains echoed again, but this time it felt more distant, almost as though whatever had been watching us had moved on. We stayed inside, huddled together in fear, the hours dragging by slowly. When the sun finally rose the next morning, the world outside seemed perfectly normal. The birds were chirping, the wind was gentle, and the mountain was bathed in the golden light of dawn. But something had changed. There was an unsettling feeling in the air, as if the night had never truly left. We spoke to our parents about the strange events of the night, asking them if they had heard anything. They looked at us curiously and asked why we had gone outside in the middle of the night. We told them that we hadn't been outside, that we had stayed on the porch the entire time. But we both knew the truth. Someone or something had been out there with us. The figure on the mountain, the footsteps around the house, the howling, unnatural sound. We had been watched. And the most chilling part, we had never figured out who or what. had been out there with us that night. The footsteps? They weren't our imagination. Something had circled the house. Something had watched us from the darkness. And whoever or whatever it was, they were never seen again. But that night, and the things we experienced, have haunted us ever since. And we can never forget the howl. The howl that seemed to carry on the wind from the mountains, and the footsteps that followed us until dawn. Who was it? What was it? We'll never know. But we do know one thing. We were not alone out there in the West Virginia wilderness. The Angry Stalker, a night that still haunts me. It was one of those nights where I worked at the casino until the early hours. My shifts were always unpredictable. Some nights I'd be done by midnight, other nights, like this one, I wouldn't be finished until around 3 a.m. The world was quiet, but it had that eerie, empty feeling that only the very late hours can bring. I wasn't worried. I was used to it by now. After work, I parked my car across the street from a small bar to grab a quick drink before heading home. It was a calm night, the kind of night where you could just sit back, take a breath, and relax. As I walked towards the bar, I noticed a man sitting outside smoking a cigarette. He didn't seem to pay me any attention, just staring into the distance with the cigarette dangling loosely from his fingers. At first, I wasn't bothered. It was late, and people tended to mind their own business at that hour. But as I got closer, something about the way he was sitting caught my attention. He wasn't moving, his gaze fixed straight ahead, like he wasn't aware of anything around him. I tried not to think too much of it, figuring he was just another person lost in his own world. I turned towards the door, ready to grab that drink and go home. Then I heard it. "Hey, hey, you," the man called out. His voice was gruff, a little slurred from the alcohol, but there was an intensity behind it. I froze for a moment, unsure whether to respond or just keep walking. He wasn't directly addressing me, but there was something in the way he spoke that made me uncomfortable. I kept walking, hoping he'd just go back to his cigarette and leave me alone. But no, he called again, louder this time. "You think you're too good for me, huh?" I ignored him. I thought it was best to not engage. People like that, drunk, angry, they fed off the attention, and I wasn't about to give him that satisfaction. So I kept walking, my pace quickening just a bit. That's when I heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps following me. I glanced over my shoulder. The man wasn't sitting on the bench anymore. He was walking towards me, his hands clenched into fists, his face contorted with anger. My heart skipped a beat. I tried to keep my cool, but my instinct screamed at me to move faster. I broke into a light jog, not looking back, not daring to. The footsteps behind me matched my pace, getting closer, faster. It was like something out of a nightmare. I could hear his breathing getting louder, feel his presence closing in on me. I rounded the corner towards the building where I lived. The front door was only a few meters away, but in those moments, it felt like miles. The door worked on a delay. You had to put your key in and wait for it to automatically open. That feeling of vulnerability, of standing there exposed, waiting for the door to open, was almost unbearable. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking. The footsteps were so close now. I could hear his voice again, this time filled with rage, shouting something I couldn't make out. It didn't matter. I was too focused on getting inside. The door finally creaked open, just enough for me to slip inside. I slammed it shut behind me, barely catching a glimpse of the man before the door clicked into place. I thought I was safe, but I wasn't. The man rammed his shoulder against the door with an ear-splitting thud. I jumped back, my heart racing as he screamed, his voice a mixture of fury and frustration. His fists hammered against the door, and I could hear him shouting curses, threats, things that made no sense. I pressed myself against the door, terrified that at any moment it might give way. My mind raced. What if I hadn't gotten inside in time? What if he had caught me? I wasn't sure what he wanted, but the anger in his voice was enough to tell me that this was no random encounter. This was something more sinister. The man's pounding continued for what felt like an eternity. He shouted for what seemed like forever, the noise reverberating through the hallway. I stayed as quiet as I could, trying not to let him hear my breath. The seconds stretched on endlessly. Finally, after what felt like hours, the pounding stopped. I dared to breathe again, though every inch of my body was still on high alert. I pressed my ear to the door, listening. Silence. Absolute silence. I waited a few more minutes before peeking out through the small window by the door. No sign of him. No sound. I stood there, shaking, my heart still racing, wondering if he had left or if he was just waiting. I don't remember when I fell asleep that night. I just remember the dread that stayed with me for weeks after. I never saw that man again. But the memory of his angry footsteps, the sound of him pounding on that door, it's something that still haunts me to this day. The fear, the adrenaline, the pure panic of knowing you're being followed, of knowing that someone is just behind you, chasing you down. I've had close calls before, but nothing quite like that night. And every time I hear footsteps behind me now, no matter where I am, I can't help but wonder, is it him? Will I ever truly be safe from that anger? The Man in the Snow, a chilling tale of stalking. When my mom was younger, she used to babysit for a family that lived a few streets over from ours. It was the kind of job you took when you were looking for a little extra cash, just a few hours of quiet time, making sure the kids were safe and sound while the parents had their night out. Nothing out of the ordinary. But one night, something happened that would stick with her forever. It was a cold winter evening, and she was babysitting for this particular family. The kids were already asleep, tucked into their beds, and she was curled up in the living room, reading a book and keeping an eye on the house. The kind of night you expect when you're doing a simple babysitting job. But this night was different. The house was quiet, the only sound the soft hum of the heater and the occasional creak of the old wood floor. It was a peaceful night, but that all changed when the phone rang. My mom picked up the receiver, expecting it to be the parents checking in or perhaps a wrong number. But when she answered, it wasn't anyone she knew. "Hello," she said, her voice tentative. It was the neighbor, a woman who lived across the street. Her voice sounded shaky. Her words rushed. "I can see you," she said, almost in a whisper. My mom furrowed her brow, confused. "What? Who are you talking to?" "The kids," the neighbor continued. "I can see you and the kids in the living room. I just wanted to let you know, there's a man in your yard." My mom's blood ran cold. The neighbor wasn't sure if she had just seen him pass by, or if he was lingering around, but the words man and yard struck fear into my mom instantly. She stood up, peering out the window, but saw nothing unusual. It was dark outside, and the only thing visible in the yard was the snow, a fresh layer of white that had fallen in the last few hours. "Are you sure?" my mom asked, trying to keep calm. "I'm sure," the neighbor replied. "He's standing in your yard, looking in through the windows. I've already called the police." My mom didn't waste another second. She immediately went to check the windows, her heart racing in her chest. She couldn't see anything at first, but the sensation of someone watching her, staring at her, was enough to send a wave of dread over her. She hung up the phone and went to the front door, cautiously peering outside. The snow crunched under her feet as she took slow steps toward the window, hoping that maybe it was just her imagination. But as she looked outside, she saw nothing. Then the sound of sirens pierced the air, and the police arrived, lights flashing in the driveway. By the time they got there, the man was gone. But when they checked the area around the house, they found something disturbing. Footprints, a trail of large, heavy footprints all over the yard. They led to each window, circling the house, stopping at every one. It was clear that the man had been standing there, watching them, and not just once, but multiple times, lingering at every window, peering inside as if he was studying them. The police couldn't find the man, and there was no sign of forced entry. It was as though he had come out of nowhere, only to disappear just as quickly. The worst part was that the neighbor had been watching the entire time. She had seen him through her own window, but the man had never made a sound. No footsteps, no knocking on the door, no indication that he was even there. When the police left, the feeling of unease remained. My mom stayed the rest of the night, not daring to sleep, every creak of the house or rustle of the wind outside sending her into a fit of panic. And to this day, when she talks about that night, there's a certain tone in her voice, a quiet, lingering fear that never quite left her. The man in the yard, the footprints in the snow, and the realization that someone had been watching them all along. We never knew who he was or what he wanted, but the fear of knowing someone was lurking outside, just out of sight, Watching and waiting, that's something that sticks with you. So when you're alone at night sitting by your window, just remember that there may be someone watching, waiting, just as my mom experienced all those years ago. The unexplainable pain, a chilling story of forewarning. It was just a few days before the tragic events in Norway that would forever be etched in the world's memory. My friend and I were hanging out, doing what we usually did, talking about life, our usual banter, and catching up. But that day, something felt off. He mentioned to me that he'd been experiencing severe stomach cramps for the past few days. At first, I thought it was just a stomach bug or something he ate. But then he told me something strange. His right hand hurt. Not just a dull ache, but real, sharp pain that made it hard for him to move it. I tried to brush it off at first, but seeing the worry in his eyes, I couldn't ignore it. We decided to go see a doctor, hoping it was nothing serious. Maybe a pulled muscle or a mild infection. Something simple, right? We sat in the waiting room, and my friend tried to downplay it, cracking a joke here and there. But I could tell he wasn't as calm as he seemed. He kept rubbing his stomach and flexing his hand, wincing with each movement. I wasn't sure what was going on, but I could feel the tension in the air. It wasn't just physical pain, there was something more unsettling about it. Something that didn't sit right. When we finally saw the doctor, he ran some tests. After a thorough examination and a series of questions, the doctor gave us the answer we didn't want to hear. Nothing was wrong. He couldn't find any cause for the pain, no medical reason for the cramps or the discomfort in his hand. He suggested it was probably stress or something minor and gave him some painkillers to ease the discomfort. We left the doctor's office feeling a bit confused. It didn't make sense. Pain so intense for no apparent reason. But we tried to move on, hoping it would go away on its own. But 3 days later, everything changed. I'll never forget that day. It was a day that started like any other. But then came the news that would shake me to my core. The tragic, horrific news of the attack in Norway. The violence, the chaos, the heartbreak. The phone rang as I sat there, still trying to process the horrible reports. It was a friend calling, but what they told me next made my blood run cold. It was my friend, the one who had been suffering those strange pains just days before. He was dead. The details were shocking. He had been in the area during the attack. He had been struck by gunfire, 3 bullets to the stomach and 1 to his right hand, the very hand he had complained about days earlier. The same hand that had caused him such excruciating pain, the same part of his body that had been the source of his discomfort. He had died on the scene, his body ravaged by the bullets, leaving me in a state of disbelief. How was this even possible? In the days leading up to the tragedy, he had felt something in his body, a warning, perhaps. Maybe it was a sign his body was trying to send, but we couldn't decipher it in time. The pain, the cramps, the strange sensations. Had they been his body's way of telling him something was terribly wrong? I'll never have the answers, but I'll always wonder, could he have known what was about to happen? Could that excruciating pain have been a strange premonition? A final warning before the inevitable? I can still picture his face. The one he wore when he told me about his symptoms. The confusion and concern in his eyes. He had no idea what was coming, and neither did I. But in the end, we both felt it. We felt the weight of something dark and terrifying, something we couldn't explain. I can't help but think back to that day, to the warning signs, and the awful twist of fate. Was it just a coincidence? Or was it something more, something beyond our understanding? My friend is gone now, taken too soon, in the most tragic of ways. But I'll always carry with me the memory of those strange, unexplained symptoms he felt. Symptoms that, in hindsight, seem far too eerie to be dismissed as simple coincidence. The Man Who Knocked, a true story of a serial killer. It was an ordinary evening, one of those quiet nights where everything seems peaceful and you're just winding down for bed. But what happened that night? I'll never forget. It was around 9 p.m. and I was alone at home. I had just finished a late dinner and was curled up on the couch, flicking through channels when I heard it. A loud, insistent knocking at my front door. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Maybe someone had the wrong house. But then it came again, even louder this time. Knock, knock, knock. My heart began to race. No one ever knocked at my door that late, and I wasn't expecting anyone. I got up, cautiously walking toward the door, but I didn't open it. I peered through the peephole. I couldn't see anyone at first. Then I saw him, standing there, just inches from the door. He was a tall man, wearing a dark jacket and a baseball cap. He didn't seem to be in a hurry, and there was no sign of an emergency. He just stood there, his hand resting on the doorknob, knocking over and over again. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. Something wasn't right. I didn't recognize him. Why was he knocking like that? My instincts kicked in, and I backed away from the door, my mind racing. I called out through the door, "Who are you? What do you want?" But he didn't answer. He just kept knocking, as though he hadn't heard me. I could hear his breathing on the other side, slow and steady. Panic set in. I was alone, and this was no random knock. Something about him felt off. He was too calm, too persistent. I rushed to grab my phone and called the police. My hands were shaking, and I could barely get the words out, but I told them what was happening. Someone was at my door, knocking, and I felt unsafe. "I need you to come right now," I begged, my voice trembling. "I think he's dangerous. I don't know who he is, but I'm scared." I didn't want to take my eyes off the door, but I knew I had to. I backed away slowly, hoping he wouldn't force his way inside. For what felt like an eternity, I stayed there waiting for the police to arrive. Finally, after what seemed like forever, the knocking stopped. I heard him walking away. Slowly, I approached the door again, but when I looked through the peephole, he was gone. I breathed a sigh of relief, though my heart was still racing. I didn't feel safe enough to leave the house for hours. The police showed up shortly after, but by then the man was long gone. They checked around the house, but found no sign of forced entry or anything suspicious. They advised me to keep my doors locked and to stay alert, but they didn't seem too concerned. The weirdest part? That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had seen that man before. His face lingered in my mind, like something I couldn't place. A few days later, I was flipping through the news when I saw his face again, this time on the television. My stomach dropped. The man who had been knocking on my door was a serial killer. A man who had been linked to multiple disappearances over the past few years. They had finally caught him. His name was all over the news. The authorities had traced him through a series of clues and tips from people who had seen him in different areas. His bus, the one I had glimpsed as he walked away from my house, was his usual vehicle for traveling from one location to the next. The news report confirmed what I had feared. He was dangerous, and he had been stalking his next victim, which could have very well been me. The realization hit me hard. The man who had knocked at my door, the man I had been too afraid to face directly, was the same man that the police had been hunting for. He was a killer, and he had come to my house at night, alone, with no regard for my safety. I'll never forget the feeling of that night. The door knocking, the icy fear that gripped me, and the overwhelming relief that I had gotten away. What if I hadn't been home that night? What if I had opened the door? Would he have attacked me? Would I have been his next victim? Now, every time I hear a knock at the door late at night, I freeze. I can't help it. The memory of that man, his face, and the terror I felt will haunt me forever. The Stalker in the Shadows, a true creepy encounter. I remember when I was a little girl, I didn't have curtains in my bedroom. My parents had just moved into a new house, and the windows were bare. The only thing that shielded me from the outside world was the light from the street lamp right outside my window. At night, that dim, yellowish glow would fill the room and cast shadows on my walls. I remember lying in bed, wide awake, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sound of my dad snoring in the next room. It was always comforting to hear him like that. He was close, and it made me feel safe. But one night, something was off. As I lay there, I noticed a shape on my wall, just above my bed. At first, I thought it was just the shadow of an old car passing by, or maybe the wind making a tree branch sway. But when I focused, I realized something was wrong. The shape wasn't the usual distortion of moving cars or branches. It was the silhouette of a man, a tall figure, standing perfectly still outside my window. I was frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my imagination, but the longer I stared, the more I realized this wasn't a shadow from the streetlight. This was something or someone real. I could hear my father snoring from the next room, so I knew it wasn't him. But the figure outside, it was a man, and he was standing right outside my window, just inches away, staring inside at me. I couldn't breathe. My young mind raced with all sorts of thoughts, and I tried to convince myself that maybe I was imagining it. But deep down, I knew this wasn't normal. It felt wrong. For the next few nights, it happened again. That same figure, appearing at the same time. Sometimes I would see him standing perfectly still. Other times, I would just catch a glimpse of him moving, his shadow stretching across my wall. Every time it happened, I would lie there in silence, terrified to move, not knowing what to do. My eyes would be glued to the shadow, my body paralyzed with fear, and my heart would race uncontrollably. But the most terrifying part, he could see me. I realized that this man, whoever he was looking straight at me from just outside my window. He could see me lying in my bed, while I could barely make out his form through the dim light. I remember thinking, what if he tries to come inside? What if he's been doing this for days, watching me while I sleep? The thought of someone peering into my room while I had no idea was enough to make my skin crawl. I had no idea who this man was or why he was doing this, but I knew I was being watched. It was more than just a creepy feeling, it was real. I began to think that maybe it was something paranormal, maybe a ghost, a spirit trying to communicate. But after one final night of watching the shadow appear again, something inside me snapped. I couldn't ignore it anymore. This wasn't something supernatural. This wasn't a figment of my imagination. This was a real person, a man standing just outside my window, watching me night after night. I was horrified, but I also felt a strange sense of relief. It wasn't a ghost, at least, but the truth was far worse. There was someone out there who had been peering into my room, someone who knew exactly when I was in bed and could see me lying there, completely vulnerable. I never told my parents, too scared to admit that someone was watching me in my own home. I stayed silent, hoping it would go away. But it didn't. The shadow kept appearing. Finally, after what felt like days of terror, the man stopped coming around. I never saw him again, and the shadows on the wall stopped haunting me. I'll never forget the feeling of being watched, knowing that someone was out there, lurking in the dark, and I had no idea who they were or what their intentions were. It wasn't just my imagination. It wasn't paranormal. It was a real man, someone who had been spying on a little girl, watching her every night. And I never found out who he was. The man in the backyard. A terrifying experience. I was 16 years old when my parents decided to take a weekend trip. They trusted me enough to stay home alone. And honestly, I was excited to have the house to myself for a couple of days. There was something thrilling about the idea of having the whole place to myself. No rules, no one telling me to do this or that. Just me and my video games. One evening after dinner, I settled in the living room with my gaming console. The TV was in front of me, and next to it was a large glass wall that led out to the backyard. It wasn't a huge yard, but it was big enough to have some trees, a small garden, and a few areas that were hard to see from inside, especially at night. But I didn't think anything of it. I was too engrossed in my game to pay much attention to anything else. Then, something caught my eye. At first, I thought it was just a cat or maybe a bird darting across the yard, but as I glanced over, I saw movement again. It was bigger than a cat. My heart skipped a beat when I looked more closely. There was a man sitting right in the middle of the yard. I froze. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. He was crouching low, almost blending in with the shadows, but there was no mistaking it. He was staring directly at me. His eyes were fixed on me, wide open, like he was waiting for something. A chill ran down my spine, and the room suddenly felt colder. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to look away. It felt like time had stopped. I don't know how long we just stared at each other, but I knew something wasn't right. He wasn't supposed to be there. My heart was pounding, and I had no idea what to do. Should I call the police? Should I scream? I didn't know. And then, just as quickly as I'd seen him, he realized I saw him too. His eyes widened, and for a split second, it was like the world froze. He was caught. And in that moment, his expression changed from calm to frantic. He jumped up and bolted away, running toward the fence that separated the yard from the woods behind our house. I quickly ran to the door, locked it, and went straight to the phone to call my parents. My voice was shaking, and I could hardly form words. I tried to explain what had happened, but they were too far away to help. They told me to stay inside, lock all the doors, and wait until they came back. But the fear didn't leave me. Even after I hung up, I sat in the living room, staring out the window, expecting to see him again. My mind kept replaying the image of him crouching there, staring at me, as if he had been waiting for me to notice. And when I finally did, it was like he had gotten caught doing something he shouldn't have. I never saw the man again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he had been watching me for a while before I noticed him. Maybe he had been there for hours, just waiting for me to finally glance up. To this day, I don't know who he was or what he wanted, but I'll never forget the fear I felt, realizing that someone was in my backyard, watching me without my knowledge. That night, I slept with the lights on, and I haven't been alone in that house since without checking every window and door. The man in the garage. A close call. It was a typical evening when my friend found herself in a situation that would haunt her for years. She had just finished a long day and was heading to her car in the underground parking garage near her apartment. The garage was quiet, almost eerily so, with only the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead. As she walked to her car, something caught her eye. There, on the cold concrete floor, was a man lying down. He wasn't moving, and at first, she thought he might have passed out or was perhaps just resting. But then she noticed something. Something wasn't right. His clothes were a bit torn, and there was blood, something she hadn't expected to see. She approached cautiously, her heart beginning to race as she tried to assess the situation. She didn't know if he was hurt or in some kind of trouble, but something about the whole scene felt off. When she got closer, she saw the source of the blood, a deep wound on his head. He was breathing, albeit weakly, and his eyes fluttered open as she knelt beside him. The man, looking dazed and confused, told her he had been attacked by someone. He seemed harmless enough, though there was a strange urgency in his voice, almost as if he was trying to manipulate her into helping him. Being a kind person, my friend's instinct was to help. She knew she had to get him to a hospital, so she offered to take him. She helped him up, and he carefully climbed into the passenger seat of her car, groaning with each movement. She placed his bag in the back seat, and they started driving. The whole time, though, a nagging feeling in the back of her mind wouldn't go away. Something about the way the man spoke, the way he seemed too calm for someone who had just been attacked, bothered her. The more she thought about it, the more uneasy she became. It was too quiet, too perfect. Something fell off. Suddenly, the idea hit her. What if he was trying to set her up? What if this wasn't just an innocent man in distress, but someone with a far more sinister agenda? That's when she decided to act. In the middle of the drive, she pulled over to the side of the road. Without saying anything, she asked him to check the back tire. The man, still weak, nodded and opened the car door. But as soon as he stepped out of the car, my friend didn't hesitate. She slammed the door shut and sped off, driving straight toward the nearest police station, her heart pounding in her chest. When she arrived at the police station, still shaken but determined, she quickly told the officers about the man and the strange situation. The police were skeptical at first but agreed to investigate. They went to the area where she had picked him up, and sure enough, they found his car and his bag. And that's when things took a terrifying turn. In the man's bag, they found several large garbage bags and a butcher's knife, the kind used by professional butchers. The officers were immediately alarmed. They quickly checked the parking garage's security footage and saw the man walking around, seemingly waiting for someone. The footage was chilling. It was clear that he had been laying in wait for a victim. As it turned out, the man had been involved in several strange incidents in the area before, but no one had been able to connect the dots. The police searched for him, but by the time they arrived at his house, he had vanished, slipping through their grasp. To this day, the man was never caught. The authorities never managed to find out what he was really up to. My friend still remembers the look in his eyes when he realized she had caught on. It's a close call she'll never forget. Thank you for listening to these dating stories. Hopefully you enjoyed them. Please like and subscribe if you want to hear more of my dating experiences.